Hi there, my name's Francis Fidgent, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Judy Higgins and Laurie Colpoys for a continuing discussion on cultures of thinking and action. Today's discussion is going to focus on Mindset 5, which is learning as a consequence of thinking. If you haven't already done so, we'd recommend getting Ron Richards' book, Cultures of Thinking and Action, as an anchor text for considering some of the ideas and points that will be raised in this discussion. Particularly, this discussion, Mindset 5, focuses on pages 101 to 120. We also recommend that you capture your thinking as you go along. In particular, connections that you make with your experience, authors' ideas that you'd challenge, concepts you think are worth considering, and changes you think the author is suggesting to your practice or perhaps to your school as well. Just a quick reminder, there are a number of resources that are available at KnowAtom.com to continue this conversation or have this conversation again with your own team, whether that's a colleague at your grade level or something at a larger level building wide. So take a look at those resources, a recording of today's session, reflection questions, as well as a summary and blog post of today's discussion at KnowAtom.com. Kicking off our conversation today, we wanted to focus on this quote here, which is learning is a consequence of thinking. Retention, understanding, and the active use of knowledge can be brought about only by learning experiences in which learners think about and think with what they're learning. Findings from cognitive science have shown that to build usable knowledge, we need to play with it, push it around, think through and with it, rather than merely memorize it. David Perkins drives home this point by saying, thinking is what brings knowledge to life, what puts it to work, what tests it against the standard of evidence, what mobilizes it to make connections and predictions, and what shapes it toward creative products and outcomes. So lots to take in here. What distinctions can be made between knowledge and understanding? This might be a great spot to start sort of our reflections. And to what extent do assessments even require thinking? So I don't know, I'm going to open that up.
I would love to start with this one because it brought back a great memory of, this was a lot of years ago. I've been teaching for a while. When we first started looking and thinking about thinking, understanding, are there different kinds of thinking? And I had gone to a professional development session about how we do that. And we basically focused on, I can't remember exactly what we called it at that time, but it was basically picture thinking. And when I came back to school, I had thought about this book I had, and this was a younger grade that I was teaching at that point. I think it was first grade, possibly kindergarten. But the book had no writing. It was nothing but pictures. And it was called A Day in the City. And every page was really vibrant with everything that was going on in a city. And there were dogs, there were people walking around, there were cars. It was a very busy city. So it started out with looking at the picture and asking the students what they saw. So they had a lot to say, but one student was particularly fixated on this man who was walking down the street and he had a book in front of his face and he was reading the book. And he had a lot of questions about that. And so I said, well, tell me what you're thinking. And he said, well, he shouldn't be walking down the street with a book. And so everybody started looking at that. So I said, well, why? And he said, well, you just shouldn't. And that's literally what he said. You just shouldn't. Okay, all right. So we moved on. Well, at this point, it was really funny because I wish you could see the book because there's a million things going on. Well, at this point, the whole class is fixated with where's the man with the book? And they'd find him every time. And as the story went on, the man started to potentially get in some trouble. Like at one point, he tripped. And so the students were like, oh, he like tripped over the curb. And then another page, he almost stepped on a dog. And then he almost got hit by a car. And all these things kept happening. And at every point, they'd start to like, really start to answer great questions about, well, I mean, what if he had gotten hit? Like, what if the car didn't, because I'd say things like, well, did he notice the car? And they'd say, no, because he's reading the book. The car noticed him. And that was the only reason he didn't get hit by the car. And so finally, at like many, many pages on, he slipped on a banana peel and fell down. Well, they thought this was the best thing ever. And they had so many things to say about why he had fallen down. And so I started saying, well, what happened this time? Well, he didn't see the banana peel and he fell. So it's okay, so well, tell me more about that. And so they started noticing, well, he ripped his pants. Oh my gosh, his shoe fell off. And then they noticed that he had crashed into a hot dog cart. And it was the most amazing thing for me as a teacher to like listen to the kinds of discussions we were having. And I was just simply saying things like, well, what else happened? Why do you think that had happened? And they started talking about, well, he wasn't looking, but he caused problems for everybody else. It wasn't just his pants that ripped, he tipped over the hot dog cart. And the kind of thinking that was going on was absolutely dazzling to me. And I said, well, why did this happen? And they said, well, he couldn't see what was coming. He couldn't, and they kind of were talking about, all the cues around him that had caused all these problems and all the consequences of this action. And I was thinking about when the question that we have here, to what extent do assessments require thinking? And I thought immediately like, wow, imagine if I had a simple assessment for this story, such as, should you read while walking? Yes.
Right.
Nope.
Right.
Clear. Or what problems might you encounter if you're reading while walking? And
Right.
these kids could have gone on for days, sort of, and making connections, everything that was going on in that classroom in that short time with very young students was just amazing to me. And that I remember that instantly when I read this part.
Hmm. It's interesting because I could picture books like that. I know that, for example, my son's books as a toddler, like Richard
Mhm.
Scarry's
Oh
books.
yeah, busy people.
Exactly,
Yeah,
Busy Town. That's
Yeah,
right.
busy
busy
town.
town.
Yeah,
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 And
yeah.
Cars and Trucks and Things That Go. And it's very much a
yeah.
similar model, although there are some little blips of text on the page.
Mm.
But it's that busy kind of scene, like a Where's Waldo almost.
Yes.
And yet what's really interesting that I'm taking away from what you're saying is that the part of the distinction between knowledge and understanding is how students play it says here in the quote, it's how students um, play with it,
Yes.
how they have this opportunity to pull connections together, and I think what he calls, or what's quoted here as, active use of knowledge. So
Mhm.
those simple assessments where, what color was the man's hat carrying the book, um, that is a super low level
Mhm.
assessment. It doesn't require any thinking at all, and yet both groups of students who really understand something, as well as students who really don't understand something, could answer that question. This person with the book wears a green hat, but if students have been engaged in an environment where they are encouraged to think, to really use those thinking moves that we've talked about before, and in Mindset 5, we talked about those thinking moves where they're going below the surface of what's happening as this person is progressing through the story, reading a
Yeah.
book, withdrawn, in a sense, disconnected from their surroundings. they're causing problems for themselves, but they're also causing problems for others. And so then that becomes something that takes on a whole new level in terms of understanding the consequence, not only the behavior and sort of the perpetrator, but also the consequences of that and the
Right.
impact on the society, which requires, and I think it's brought up here later in our chapter in Mindset 5, where talk about depth of understanding.
Yes.
And when we think about depth of understanding, the highest or the deepest level of understanding is extended reasoning. And the lowest level is this sort of recall. What color was the hat that the walker was wearing? It was green. Okay, recall, low level understanding. It's not understanding,
Well,
it's
I don't even
knowledge,
understand it.
factual. It's right. It's
Right.
not even understanding.
Right.
And so I think and I want to give Lori some space here to share her thoughts, but when I look at this question and think about your story and I think about this quote, for me, this is at the root of the problem, if we want to call it that, of education. It's the real Achilles heel of education. It's what is the difference between knowledge and understanding, and do you see one, first of all? And secondly, how is that affected? How do we affect understanding if that's something that's greater than knowledge? And I also think there was a quote in here that leads off after the intro on page 101 that I really appreciate. I won't read the whole quote, but basically paraphrasing, this second paragraph on page 101 breaks out the difference between intentional learning and incidental learning. And I think that, I guess I will read this because I think it's important for folks that don't have the book. You might agree that the kind of intentional learning Perkins is talking about, the learning that we actively seek out and create for ourselves. The deeper learning rooted in meaning making and understanding does require thinking. And then down here it says, surely we can acquire knowledge without thought. We might refer to this as incidental learning, the learning that just seems to happen to us without much intentionality. And understanding, so my takeaway for this is that education in general, globally, I don't think it's just an American thing. I don't think it's just a public school thing or a private school thing or a charter school thing. I think it's as much a parent thing as it is a teacher thing, that people look at education as being the acquisition of knowledge, and they look at it as these facts, and they maybe reflect on their own experience or so on and so forth. And so gaining facts that are easy to replicate, in a sense, that's what's discussed here later in the chapter, is seen as education, is seen as learning. And a child can go through that entire process. A school can be designed and a curriculum can be designed for that process. And we can assign grades and we can graduate and all of these sort of things, but yet we really haven't developed any understanding in students, or students maybe haven't developed understanding because they haven't necessarily developed an ability to perform that knowledge in lots of different contexts. They haven't developed an ability to really work with it, to what's said here, test it against the standard of evidence and mobilize it and use it toward creative products and outcomes. It's really maybe been geared towards sort of a recall. And I think that the folks that do see a difference between understanding and knowledge, and understanding being that ability to really use knowledge to create with it, I think they have a tremendous advantage. But it's almost two groups, I think, that struggle to hear each other and to understand each other. And I won't riff on it anymore, but like it just, and I'm not sure it's even articulate in what I'm saying, but I do see this I do see this very clear difference, and
Mhm.
I think when that difference is solved, I think education in general will be much more meaningful for students.
Yeah, you said earlier, how do you affect understanding? So sort of how do you mobilize it? And it's interesting. I thought a lot about this, and I sort of jotted down my distinctions between knowledge and understanding. And then thinking of Judy's story, Judy, what did the little boy say in the beginning? Something like,
Just
You
with a
shouldn't.
basic statement, you shouldn't read while you walk.
right. And he couldn't really do much else with that.
Exactly,
And
exactly.
then as the book unfolded, and with your careful questioning and careful observation and going a little bit deep, he probably was going to be able to articulate a little bit better. So it kind of made that connection for me when Francis is saying, how do you affect understanding? But
Right.
when I think of the two, I think sometimes people think of them one and the same. It's just a misunderstanding of language almost, but I think of knowledge as being pretty static. And
Mm.
understanding being a little more dynamic. And of course, knowledge can be, related to facts and all that, or it can even be skill-based. I think about kids being able to carry out multi-digit addition as a procedure, but not rooted in any understanding of place value. The teacher that says carry the one instead of talking about what that one is, it's going to the tens place and it's worth 10, so,
Right.
things being very procedural. And when it's static knowledge, it's like you can't recognize it when it's presented in different contexts. You can't
Mhm.
understand the implications of it. You can't connect it to other things. So in that way, it's not useful anyway. You think about this quote. And then when I think of understanding, that's more dynamic. To me, it's kind of two things. It's having that knowledge and being able to think about the application of it. And I can't help think of the KnowAtom, science curriculum and how that plays out in the curriculum. But also it's kind of that comprehension. So it's the application, but it's also comprehension at a deeper level. It's like we know exercise is good for us. We might have the knowledge that it's good for our heart or that it builds muscles, but understanding is the hows and whys behind it, the physiology. And, so to me, understanding is going deep. It's doing something with that knowledge,
Mhm.
being creative with it.
Mhm.
And if you get to the end of the year and you're focused on knowledge, that's kind of a lost year for those kids. Unfortunately, it's not building those dispositions of learning. So pretty big implications in this quote when you think about it.
Yeah.
And I think, and I don't, maybe time's getting away from us a little bit here, but I think this has big implications for AI and AI in the classroom too. Because I think as we kind of look forward, and one of the things I've been doing a lot of research on lately is AI in education and thinking about generative AI and its relationship to people, and particularly in social situations. And what's really interesting is uh, content developed with AI is is highly detectable. And one of the reasons that it's highly detectable is it lacks something called perplexity and burstiness.
Mm.
Mm.
And
What's the other word?
burstiness, it's a funny term. But the long and short of it is that humans, when they communicate, tend to communicate things in ways that are somewhat perplexing and complex. And so
Mm.
we're inferring things. We're bringing up one idea and then pivoting to another one, and we are using sentence structures that are varied, and all of these things are the result of our understanding of language and ideas and pulling connections together. And why is that? Why is that? Because we understand how to communicate. We have empathy, like we have deep understanding of a lot of elements of what it is to be human and to communicate and to connect and all these sort of things and concepts. computers don't have that. So one of the ways that you can detect AI content is simply to look at how direct and simple and how little perplexity and how little perplexity that there is in the concepts and how little complexity there is in the communication structure. And so what's kind of interesting to me about that, and the implication I think in this case, is that computers and artificial intelligence models have knowledge, and they can produce knowledge faster, better than humans can. But what they lack is an understanding. They don't understand those terms. They don't understand empathy. They don't understand juxtaposition. They don't understand all the sort of things that we do. And so what I think is kind of interesting is that the value of understanding in our society today and looking forward, I think, is gaining value as in a lot of ways content and ideas are becoming more sort of homogeneous and simplified in a sense. And we think about reading complex text or inferring meaning from text or inferring meaning from a sentence even. And these sort of things that we are trying to do it just in an ELA context in the classroom. Our society is moving towards models that are going to make that in a sense much simpler, but it's also going to make understanding each other much harder if we're not building that skill set to handle things like perplexity and kind of the common sort of communication mechanisms. And so like here, this next quote, research shows that studying for a test is most effectively done through thinking versus review, repetition, or memorization. Creating explanations, constructing new concept maps, and self-questioning have all been shown to be far superior to reviewing one's notes or engaging in last-minute cramming when it comes to knowledge retention, recall, and application. Oops. One problem is that students themselves often don't believe this to be the case. They think they learn best when being lectured to, taking notes, reviewing those notes. They've been enculturated that that is learning. How can I help students understand the importance of thinking in their studying and learning? And just my quick takeaway on this was is helping I can help students understand the importance of thinking in their studying and learning by using questions, by giving them opportunities to perform an understanding of the knowledge that they're acquiring. And I think about I think about the classroom as being that type of environment. Whereas, kind of back to the guy with the book in the story, if the classroom environment is not focused on understanding, but just sort of knowing what happened or how it happened, and in a sense recalling that or remembering it, what have I done to require any level of thinking? And so am I honoring it? Am I holding it up in some way to show that it's important, but also to give students an experience in actually thinking with those ideas the way Judy did, by asking those questions, why do you think that happened? What else happened? Who caused that? And really turning the lens around the way she did with the walking person, from just being the person with the book's point of view, but actually the people around that person and their point of view. I see that as a key tool for helping students to understand the importance.
Yeah, definitely. I kind of zoned in on that last line. They've been enculturated that that is learning. And, we've talked about the system of school, real school and what's expected of schooling. And I always didn't want students to, like, particularly in math and science, I didn't really want, and I taught fourth grade, so perhaps a little different than the middle school level, but I didn't want them studying. I wanted to know, what do they know as a result of what we did for this past, 3 weeks to a month? What have they taken away from it? Not what did they cram and memorize before the test? So that's sort of where my mind went when I saw this. And I kind of was in a system where there was an expectation from parents as well, what can my child study? What can we do to help them, help them prepare for this test? And for me, it was always like, I don't want them to study.
Right,
I want it to
right.
be a reflection of the activities and the thinking that we did prior to the test. And I love that it talked about concept mapping and all those kinds of things, because to me, engaging in conversations and explaining is a lot better than studying your vocabulary words,
Right.
So that's kind of
Lori,
where.
what if you would have answered that parent by saying, give your student a chance to use what they know, or to challenge your student, challenge their
Yeah, I
knowledge
kind of,
of what they've learned.
yeah, and I did kind of, I would have parents ask in like conferences and things, and I didn't do study guides in math. In science, we would, they would have their vocabulary list and things like that, but that, you're right. I probably shouldn't have. I was more to please parents, I think, than anything else. But there was often a conversation with my students too about memorizing a definition versus understanding. And we did use concept mapping with vocab words. So, that was sort of what they would use, luckily, but yeah, interesting.
That's such a good point that you make, Francis, because I think, Lori, what you're trying to do in your class is, because I like that too. They've been enculturated, and students have, and teachers have, that, we're really, no matter how much we say, I don't want to be focused on the end of the year test, or I don't want to be focused on, it's hard because there's a lot of pressure. And I think to start to be able to first talk to your students about those things, be transparent
Right.
about, what, you really are gaining a lot of understanding. And I think one of the things that I remember working with in my school district, there was so much pressure on the tests. Like, we literally would practically stop teaching anything new a month before the big tests. And there'd be lots of focus on practicing the questions that we had seen last year, the questions that we thought we were going to encounter.
And think
And
of the message that sends to the students too, right?
oh my gosh, exactly. And I just remember, particularly when I first joined that school district, I was terrified because all I could focus on was, oh my gosh, they don't know anything. I didn't teach them anything. And once I got used to and knew, okay, these are the things that are going to happen. First of all, I don't have a month to give up of teaching science, to be cramming. And what I used to do is, throughout the year, I would present one of the dreaded questions. And we would play with that, and play with, all right, this is a question that, when you first look at it, you might think, well, we never learned that. We didn't study that. We didn't memorize that. And we would play with it. And we would start to talk about those. Well, can you make any connections? Can you think of anything that was like that? Can you think about, and that became such a powerful thing. And we didn't spend a lot of time on that, but it was starting to help them know, oh, wait, I can figure these things out. I have to make some connections. I have to think about, wait a minute, we did that investigation, and oh yeah, that was kind of the same thing, just because it was with, you know, butterflies as opposed to frogs. I can still think about the kind of learning. And I think that's so empowering was empowering for me, because I started recognizing there is so much learning going on in here, and there is so much understanding, but we talk a lot in this chapter about identifying all the different kinds of thinking. I think my students only thought about thinking as just recall. They got to think of that. What's the answer to that question? Help, help,
Mm.
help. As
Mhm.
opposed to, oh, let me dig down, and they say, I love the way they use the words play with knowledge. It's so fun and easy to be let's relax into this. And can anybody think of some examples of this?
Mhm.
I know my students would, oh, sorry, Francis.
No, it's okay. Go
I
ahead.
know my students would focus on, in Massachusetts, we do the MCAS test. So it was always like, is this going to be on the test? Is this something we
Yes.
have to know for the test?
Yes.
And I would always turn it around to the focus being on learning and understanding. And that's really what the test is about, is
Mhm.
what you understand and how you're learning. So let's not worry if this particular thing is on the test. Let's focus on how we're learning and using
Right.
our thinking skills. Yeah.
Because then it won't matter what's on the test because you can figure it
Right.
out.
Right, exactly. But I again, back to that enculturation of, you know, kids falling into that trap of
Yeah.
focusing way too, it being too brought up too much and too much of a focus, that dreaded end of the year test, that
Yep.
really shouldn't be the focus of your classroom.
Well,
No.
the thing that I guess react to in all of this, or that I would connect to other mindsets we've discussed here, is that it's that what was referred to as the grammar of school, and what is the work of school, and I think a lot of, and I've fallen into this myself early in my career in particular, where the work of school feels like giving students work. Like, I'm being a good teacher by giving kids work, and
Yeah.
they're being good students by doing the work. And so what do? We make work. I make work for them, they make work for me, and it's just kind of like crazy thing we do. Um, and and I think that speaks to the culture of the classroom and of the school. If the culture is, I make work for you and you make work for me, and we just sort of pass paperwork back and forth, and I'm in compliance with what my boss wants, and as the boss of my students, they're in compliance with what I want. We all get our proverbial A's, and you know we keep moving on through the system. But the thing is that all of that is just rooted in producing work. Like, it's not necessarily producing anything more than completion of a task. And so the value of the task is in is the learning, is the thinking. Is there thinking involved? And is it an opportunity to do these kind of things, create explanations, work with knowledge, perform it in novel ways? And maybe that's what I said a bit inarticulately earlier, is that I think that there are two very different schools, no pun intended, of thought on education. I think that there is a supermajority, actually, of parents, of educational environments that view school as a work environment where kids get work. And I think, Laura, you were talking to that. What work can I give my student to help them prepare for the test? That's what that parent was asking you. They're doing work in school. They see your job as giving kids work. They want to give their kids work too, because they believe that the more work they do, the better of a student they'll be. But
Right.
nobody's asking what's in the work. It's just a belief that the work leads to some value, and that somehow this work is important. But I think there's another school of thought that's, again, I think more the minority share of perspective on education. It feels, where it's more focused on what's in the work. What kind of work are we doing? What kind of work should we do? And what is the value of that work, before, and not really viewing it as work, but really as nurturing understanding. And I feel like, as educators and as schools, when we approach student learning that way, we sometimes may run into problems with parents who, and maybe that's, again, maybe not something I articulated well, and kind of dreaming what kind of response we could give this parent who sees that their student goes to school all day and now they want them to come home and do more work so that they're at the top of the class. How do we help that parent to view the work of school differently? that it's not just about task completion or memorizing vocabulary or something like that, but it's actually about challenging it. And I think about sort of the driver's ed context. It's like we can show videos, we can read books about stopping at stop signs, but the learning of how to drive a car happens behind the wheel. And and I think about driver's ed classes, and I think about the three kids that are sitting in the back watching the kid that's driving up front interacting with the road and with the instructor in the passenger seat. And it's like, to me, that's the real work, the real learning is going on there, because yeah, there's some basic knowledge, but you have to perform it. You have to interact with the environment. You have to, as the book says, as Judy mentioned earlier, play with it. Um, and there needs to be a somewhat safe context to do that. So, in the driver's ed context, you've got somebody next to you with a brake pedal.
I think
So
that's what's tough too with the parent connection too, is that they're not there during the school day. And they interpret what's happening in the classroom through the work that they see come home, so there's that as well. So,
and
you know,
administrators
yes,
even look at it that way.
yeah. And I would do a lot in newsletters and things like that to highlight the kinds of thinking we were doing in the classroom and the kinds of activities that were bringing about that kind of thinking. So they weren't just looking at this static, thing coming home, but understanding all the thinking and discussion and talking that was happening behind the scenes that they're not privy to, because they're not there during the day, or asking them to ask their student about this, so they can have a conversation about it at home and not, sit there and watch them practice addition over and over again, so I think there are things we can do to sort of bring light to teachers, to parents. And I think it's a generational thing too. I think the way parents were taught is very, hopefully, different than, sort of the things hopefully happening in classrooms today.
I think one more thing, I know we just skipped to the other slide, but I think this is such an important thing because it's something we've talked about before. How can I help students understand the importance of thinking? Remember we talked about a few mindsets ago, we talked about the brain and how happy a brain is when it's being challenged and having to think through things. And I think that's one of the things that we've either forgotten or a lot of us never knew. And we've turned thinking into such drudgery. And you've got to do this and you've got to learn that, and it's stressful. And again, we talked about that. A stressed brain is useless. A happy brain, when students can understand the joy, and I think that's we've all talked about that. We see so much with KnowAtom, the joy of figuring out a problem. I solved this. We did it. It was hard, but we kept working. And I think that's what we need to help parents see, is that it's so much fun, like you were saying, Lori, to ask your student about, tell me what happened in school today. Oh, wait, you figured that out? Tell me about that. That sounds amazing. And that we want to bring joy into that, joy and curiosity. And when students understand that, to literally explain to them, you're going to make your brain so happy, even though this is a little bit challenging right now. But I think we lose so much because so many of our students are either bored because they already know it, or overwhelmed because they have no idea and they see no path to learning.
And I think there's this elusive, and I think what this quote speaks to is that elusive, or the comfort of doing work, is that it's like, I think as a teacher, I've fallen into this. I think students fall into this. It's like, well, I get a lot of comfort by assigning work because it feels like I've done my job. And as a student, I get a lot of comfort by doing low-level work because it makes me feel like I've accomplished a lot. But it's actually a myth.
Yeah.
It's the value of the task, not the fact that it is a task, that that we need to focus on. So it makes me think of this next quote. Understanding is a matter of being able to carry out a variety of performances concerning the topic, rather than a reproductive canonical response. Canonical meaning self-referencing, sort of kind of tie back response. One's understanding tends to lie in original creative responses. Such responses require us to think with the information at hand as we construct a new meaning. Information, what we've heard, read, or seen, that does not make sense to us is quickly forgotten. And I feel like in my own personal educational experience, I can think about that. I as an undergrad, one of my concentrations was in math. I think I got to calculus 6 or 7 or something like that. And yet I feel like my high school math experience was much more powerful than my college math experience. And actually, I feel like I'm much better at algebra and trigonometry, like back of the envelope, than I am at calculus. And the reason for that is that when I was in high school, I had to play catch up. I switched schools. I had to play catch up. Actually, it was really late in middle school, my 8th grade year. I switched schools. I had to play catch up, so I had a tutor. And what we did is we focused on deriving the equations and really getting an understanding of what it was I was missing and being able to perform that in a lot of different ways. And so I feel like I developed a true understanding of algebra and trigonometry and these sort of things that I didn't develop in the context of calculus, because I didn't have that kind of rigorous back and forth where I was having to perform that knowledge in different situations and try to really figure it out. My college calculus classes were as simple as, here's a concept and just practice it over, 100 equations, and that was it. And so I
Right.
got the information, but I didn't really retain it. Like if you asked me to do some calculus right now, like I wouldn't be able to do it. I'd have to go look up a bunch of stuff. But if you asked me to, model something with algebra just off of the words on a page, like a word problem, I could do it no problem. And I think that understanding for me was the result of having to develop these kind of creative responses in lots of different ways, as opposed to just what in a math context we call plug and chug.
Yeah.
Right. It's interesting that and I've talked about this before, but I've had a lot of young student teachers, and we've also talked about warm demanders versus rescuers. And when I think of transactional teaching, it's not student-centered. It's not calling on students to think. It's the teacher doing all that heavy lifting, showing, telling, explaining, demonstrating. And the students are really passive and unfortunately unengaged. And I used to use an analogy with my student teachers, and now I can draw so much connection to doing labs in science, but cooking, imagine if you learned about cooking by somebody telling you how to cook, or you were watching somebody just demonstrate how to cook and you weren't actually cooking. Think about the difference in understanding you would have, from learning by doing, tasting, testing, mistake making. Think about the difference in your level of understanding. And that was something that we would work on the whole year, is taking a step back and making the students do that heavy lifting. Kind of like your math experience, Francis, where you had to take that understanding and apply it to different situations instead of just this rote practice. If you're cooking, you want to get to the point where you can apply that understanding and be creative with it and create new recipes and solve problems and make new dishes. And, I think that's really at the heart of learning and understanding. And again, I think this goes back to time. We have and I hate to keep harping on that, but this is being out in the field and hearing teachers, it always comes back to time. You know, we have a very full list of standards and tasks to cover, or, you know, standards that we see as tasks. And also, so much is already added to an already full school day. And I'm sure there's not a teacher out there that can't relate to that. And there's been some reform around it. When you think of the Common Core, you know, it's supposed to address that sort of less wide, more deep. But I think it all boils down to, it's helpful to think that if you're sort of marching through the curriculum and doing this transactional type of teaching, what's the end result at the end of the year?
Yeah.
You know, have they really learned? I'd prefer to build dispositions, learning skills,
Right.
build thinking skills, problem solving, and not worrying about covering every single standard, because at the end of the day, it's what they do with, you know, that knowledge.
I think also, you know, one of the problems is that there's so many assumptions made with transactional teaching where, okay, everybody's going to enter at the same level, as
Right.
opposed to, it was one of the things that was such a relief with the KnowAtom curriculum, was that it was a spiraling curriculum. And I say this to teachers all the time. You don't have to worry if your students don't know everything about the water cycle. They're going to see that again. They're going to come back to all these big concepts. So there's always different places of entry, because and I think about that, so much of the teaching that I've done over my life was, here's what we're presenting, and I'm starting here. And oops, so sorry if you don't know that yet. I'm so sorry if you already know that, but here's where we are. And, you know, that's
Such a good point, Judy. Differentiation. Like
yes.
transactional teaching, you're not even tapping into what students know or don't know.
No,
Zero
and
differentiation.
Totally. And I think one of the things, again, that I learned so well, because we used to sort of talk about lots of formative assessment, but there really wasn't that much, because I had to teach this. And like you were saying, Laura, I had to get through this curriculum. So we have to start here and we have to end there. And not having that trust that you're exposing students to things. Some are going to take it in this direction. Others are going to, you know, they're going to stay here because they're still absorbing what they're learning. And that's all valuable. And it's sort of, I think it's one of the reasons I love this book. I love that we're talking about this, because trying to think about how can we all get on the same page. And you talked about that a lot, Francis, is we've got a lot of different thinking going on. And this doesn't have to be as hard as it appears at the beginning. And it's one of the things that I so appreciate about this book is they're very gentle suggestions for how we can help everybody everybody understand at their level, because that's the other thing about understanding. We're not all going to get it at once. Not everybody got that about the man slipping on the banana peel. It took a long, you know, we went through that book slowly as everybody got their individuals. Oh, I just entered. I got it. I got where we're all going. So I think that sort of, when we think about the type of teaching or the type of allowing learning for understanding. I think that's, sometimes we think about teaching, I'm teaching this, I got to teach them this. No, I have to create opportunities for them to play with, learn, understanding, think, consider different perspectives,
Habits of mind.
Yes, yes.
Not standards, but habits of mind that help you understand the standards.
Yeah. And I think
Yes.
I think what I'm hearing and thinking about is I completely understand the challenges of time. Again, we've all been there. Like you've got students for, if you're rotating, you've got them for 40 minutes or 55 minutes or whatever. If you're at a grade level where you're self-contained, you might have them all day, but perhaps you're forced by an administrator to count minutes and you're doing your plans and whatever. It is what it is. There's only so many minutes in a day. But I think I really, I don't think that the choice is, I don't think that
Marching through.
I'm sorry, what?
Yeah, not marching through everything. That's not that's not going to get you to where you want to go.
Yeah, marching through everything isn't going to get you where you want to go, but I guess sort of what that implies is that time means the constraints, one way of looking at that that kind of what you just described there, marching through, is that we don't actually have enough time to do it all. So we need to do it, we need to not go to a more transactional model in order to get through it all. That's the aspect, as the way I might look at that. But I see this difference between transactional and relational as being outside of time. I really do. I think it's the difference between a propeller plane and a jet engine. I think it's completely different, because I think that the concept of covering standards is a highly transactional concept of what it means to teach a discipline, whereas looking at how students can be engaged in performing the expectations of the standards is a very relational way of looking at it. And so multiple standards and multiple dimensions of a standard can be involved in the same exact performance. And the more creative and the more dynamic the opportunity for that performance to be, the more valuable it is, but also the greater the learning opportunity and also the greater the standards relevance. So from a teaching perspective, it's like, I
You
think
can't
about
simplify it to standards, is what you're saying. Yeah,
you
totally.
can't simplify it to standards, but I think it's the concept of covering standards and work being these kind of transactions where standards get covered, or whatever. It's to me, it's the propeller plane model. It's like, could people, when there were only propeller planes, really think about crossing the ocean in a plane? Not really. Propeller, without pressurized cabins and so on, it's nearly impossible to do, because they're not efficient enough. But if you change the technology a little bit, then you can cross the ocean in an airplane. You need to fly at higher altitudes, and you need to be able to produce more thrust. And so in order to do that, you need to give up the propeller and you need to take on the jet engine. And now we've got a game changer. We can cross oceans, we can do all kinds of things. And I feel like the same thing's true here. If we look at the standards as a bunch of transactions, we look at curriculum as a bunch of transactions, and whether we march through it or we don't march through it, forget about time. We're not going to get enough out of the learning environment for students to be where they need to be if we can't make it relational, if we can't create those opportunities in the class for kids to really perform, because you can't get there from here with a propeller. Like, it's the ocean's too big. The skills in the context of the standards, the skills are they're too I don't want to say nuanced, but they're too vital to being
Right.
able to perform what's required.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I was like, don't use time as an excuse. You know what I mean? I was trying to say it
Yeah.
not quite so bluntly, because it isn't really related to that. But I think that's what teachers think and feel, is I don't have time for all that because, look what I have to cover, and you can't look at it as coverage.
Right. I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Well, and that,
Using that language is like covering it, like
Yeah.
literally just
Exactly.
zooming it,
Talk about
check off the
transactional,
box.
right?
Do the work,
yeah,
the work. I liked, Francis, when you talked about, I'll do work, I'll give you work, parents will do work, we're all happy with doing work. Our
right, we're
brains
getting
are
our work done.
miserable, but we're happy.
Right.
Right, the widgets of learning. Um,
Yes,
and that I think brings, connects to this slide quite well. The word think is one of the most frequently used words in the English language, and yet it's not always clear what we're talking about. Even if we are clear about what we mean, our students might not be. Therefore, it's important to develop a robust language of learning and thinking that enables us to talk about thinking explicitly with kids. We identified 8 thinking moves central to the enterprise of building understanding. And these are those 8: observing closely and describing what's there, building explanations and interpretations, reasoning with evidence, making connections, considering different viewpoints and perspectives, capturing the heart, forming conclusions, wondering and asking questions, and uncovering complexity and going below the surface of things. And this, I think, raised questions for all of us, kind of in different ways. And these were the questions that we put along with this. Are my students aware of the different kinds of thinking? What role does thinking play in creating new knowledge and understanding in the discipline? And how do I give feedback on students' thinking?
Interesting when I thought about this in my past teaching. We always talked about metacognition, thinking about your thinking. But I think maybe I could have done a little better job of naming the different kinds of thinking. We always talked about metacognition and what that meant, but I explicitly calling out exactly what they were doing when they were thinking. So great to use this kind of language. The book gave the example of them talking about bravery and, being explicit and saying, it's important to, look at your own ideas and to share your own ideas, but also consider the different perspectives of others. And that's going to enrich your understanding. So, being more explicit than just saying, think about your thinking, and reading, you were always like, metacognition.
yeah, and that feels complicated to a student, like,
Mm,
I don't know how to think about my thinking, like, what are you
right.
talking about? And one of the, I think one of the most important things that is happening in schools more and more is that we're all learning the importance of discourse and student discourse, whole class discourse, bringing the students into that wonderful world of doing things like considering other perspectives, doing things like, oh, I have to explain my thinking, I have to give examples. That was so powerful for me as a teacher when that became an important part of the day, was to discuss things. And I remember learning many times that a student did a better job explaining something than I was doing. I was explaining it the best I could, the way my book told me to. And then as we started working together, whether it was in groups or whole class, and a student would say something that another student would say, wait a minute, explain that again. Oh, I get that. I wasn't getting it before. And to be starting to have those rich conversations about identifying, there's lots of different ways to think. And suddenly that just opens up new worlds, a lot of freedom that I wasn't getting it that way, but now I'm getting it this way. I didn't realize I could approach this in other directions. And I, as a teacher, didn't realize I could help my students approach that in different directions.
Mhm. Well, and I
The
think it
stop
comes.
your,
Go ahead.
no, go
Sorry.
ahead, Francis. Go ahead.
I was just going to say again. One of the quotes in the book, in the prior chapter, was along the lines of, um, what makes humans, what gives humans, in a sense, a superpower over all other all other things in a sense. And said our ability to think socially
Mm.
um, was was the quip that was in there, and it's a superpower. And and when I think about this quote, and I think about the potential for the classroom and the kind of environment that I can create with my students by creating a culture of thinking and making it clear to students that when I talk about thinking, I'm talking about these 8 things and different combinations at different times. And there might even be different variations of these things. So we might actually have more than 8 thinking moves. But when I'm talking about thinking, I'm talking about building explanations and interpretations. I'm looking for you to go below the surface and to wonder and to share what you wonder, to ask questions when you want to when you don't feel like you understand what somebody is saying or why they're making that claim, and to look for evidence, whether that's evidence in your experience but also evidence in what somebody else is saying and the claims that they're making. That those are all part of what it is. Like those are our superpowers. you know like that's what's going to keep us ahead of the toaster forever if we so choose to engage this way. And on the other side, I think from again like an AI standpoint, I think if we don't engage in these things and we only value the quick answer, and we don't create the space for struggle, and we don't honor productive struggle as of a part of not only the learning process, but a part of the thinking process and the value, part of the process of creating value, I think we leave ourselves at a big disservice. I think that's how we become the toaster. In a
Mm.
sense, it's like, you know, it's because what does the toaster do? You put the toast in and you push the button, and after a couple minutes, it pops back up. Like, in a sense, it's doing work. How is that different than here's the worksheet, match the word to the term and hand it back. Like that's toaster level interaction. But like what we're talking about here is something toasters can't do. It's maybe someday, but not in any of our lifetimes or our children's lifetimes or even our grandchildren's lifetime. But think about, and I think, but I think about it as like, I think about how things like AI are becoming more and more powerful and taking the place of a lot of the meaningless, not meaningless, but the work that doesn't require this type of thinking. Like again, the toaster never has to go below the surface of, you know,
Mm.
up and
I
down
think
for 3 minutes.
Yeah, and I think teachers have to get out of the way. I think
Yes.
teachers sometimes do too much of the thinking in the classroom, and I think they have to step back and create a space for students to do those 8 things and stop interpreting for them, stop making connections for them, stop uncovering complexity and going below the surface yourself, push them through your questioning and, get them to do it.
Mhm.
There's a great quote that I just found in the chapter that we just read, and it said, "We sometimes neglect the importance of noticing, but it forms the basis for all analysis. The more we see, the more information we have with which to work." And I think that applies absolutely everywhere. And I think, Lori, what you were just saying about teachers, it's we have to be able to step back and notice too, and think about how are things going? What can I leave? But we also have to, and I think this is where I speak to administration, where teachers have to feel like they have permission to step back. And it's okay if you don't cover that entire unit. You've been exposing, things are going on. And I think if teachers had the time and breath to help students notice what's happening in the world, what's happening in the classroom. You've got so much more to talk about, think about, look at. And I think sometimes that, and I've been guilty of this so much, where we might be noticing something really exciting and there's great discussion going on around what just happened with this one student's group investigation, but then it's like, nope, we gotta go, we only have a few more minutes left and we have to wrap this up, to sort of open ourselves up to noticing, you know what, this is really important right now, and I'm gonna let this go. And I'm not gonna worry about, if I only have 10 minutes, do I want to drag them back into what I have to finish? Or do I want to, let's let this discussion go, because there are some really good things happening here.
Well, and I think just building on that and these last two questions that we have, I think that particularly in the area of science and engineering, these are entire disciplines that rely on thinking. They rely on these 8 moves and different combinations to, for example, science, to answer questions that are unanswered, or that have answers that are not well understood and maybe are not particularly firm answers. And so that is the role of a scientist in experimentation, is to develop an understanding and to develop new knowledge in relation to unanswered or poorly answered questions, and to do that based on evidence. And when I think about engineering, it's the same thing. It's core to the discipline of engineering is engaging in these thinking moves in order to solve problems.
Yeah, you can't go through the process without doing these 8 things.
You can't go through the process, but if you even outside of a process, it is what the discipline is.
It is the discipline, yeah.
Like we can talk about bridges all day long, who built them and what they are and the names of the parts. We can talk about rocks and the kinds of rocks and what they're made of all day long. That's all knowledge. It's really, again, it's nothing more than the toaster. It's like, there are 3 kinds of rocks. Here's how they are made. It's nothing particularly unique, but it's also not science. That's I think kind of the real funny part of all of it is, or the irony is, that the work of that transactional interaction and calling it science or calling it engineering, we're all going to make this car just like me, let's put it together. It is not a task that requires understanding. It's not an opportunity to perform an understanding. It's just pneumatic, and that is not what engineers do, and it's not what scientists do. So it's fundamental to developing students' mastery of the performance expectations dimension of the standards, for them to be engaged in the way that's authentic to the discipline. And I think giving feedback on students' thinking, for me as a teacher, is modeling and engaging my thinking about their thinking and in relation to their thinking. So that's why we have these, often examples that you two have shared many times. Tell me more about that, or what makes you say that, or how did you come to that decision, or tell me more about why you disagree. What would you base that on? What observations or what evidence? Because those questions give a kind of feedback that's not, again, this kind of transactional feedback where it's A+ or F. It's
correct.
it's pushing back for more thinking, and in the process of pushing the students' thinking, we actually get deeper understanding. And so to me, again, it's the jet engine versus propeller plane. There's no way that we could, in a transactional sense, I think, evaluate every element of a student's ability to perform the expectations. But if we take a jet engine approach and we use questions and we use formative assessment and we push for deeper thinking, the student either gets there or they don't. And when they don't, then that's an opportunity to ask more questions and provide supports, and to illuminate the kind of thinking we're looking for if it's not already been made clear, or those sort of things. So again, a little bit outside of time, we need to think about how we use time differently as opposed to potentially just needing more of it, I think. I don't know if we want to move on to the next slide. I was thinking this kind of, let me see here. For students to engage in thinking, they need to encounter learning tasks that regularly go beyond the reproduction of knowledge. They need tasks that call for original thinking rather than simple recall of facts. Therefore, a curriculum focused on big ideas which builds students' conceptual understanding while promoting deeper learning is more likely to be one in which thinking will play a central role. Students have shown that the regular use of thinking routines to prompt, support, and scaffold student thinking produces better learning outcomes. What routine structures and experiences can I develop to promote deeper understanding in my classroom? Is the focus on the learning or the work? How can I probe, challenge, and support student thinking?
This is so much of what we were literally just talking about, is the focus on the learning or the work, where the work is, I've got X time, I've got to get this done. Or is it, well, I didn't get to everything today, but boy, we had some great conversations. And I think one of the things, to go back to all the different types of thinking, I always like so much that I feel like wondering was reintroduced into the classroom when we started talking about kinds of thinking, because there wasn't room or space for a lot of wondering. I'm going to tell you how to do it. Just hang on, stop wondering. I'm going to tell you, and then we'll all be good. And that is such a powerful thing when students get told that it is okay to wonder, it is okay not to understand, it is okay to enter a discussion by being able to say, can anybody help me with this? I don't understand that. Because I found that so many of my students felt that a discussion was talking about what you knew. And those were the students that got all the airtime, as opposed to, wait, stop, I don't understand that. Tell me how you did that. Show me what you did. And I think the routines, when we're starting out at a very young age with kindergartners, with wows and wonders. What's amazing to you and what are you wondering about? That's such a great journey that we're starting very early, that's an important part of a conversation. That's an important part of a discussion that we're going to have about whatever it is we're doing today or what we did yesterday.
Mhm.
Definitely. I know this quote was under the heading focus on understanding while making the thinking active. So when I think about routine structures and experience, obviously you want it to be active, and you want it to be collaborative, you want it to be hands-on, but it also kind of boils it down, which I thought was so interesting, because I could draw lots of parallels to KnowAtom, and it just seemed like such a good list to reflect on when you're thinking about what curriculum you want to use or what you want your curriculum to be, or when you're looking at new curriculum. And it talked about a lot of different things, activation of prior knowledge. It talked about ongoing elaboration of new ideas, so connection to Socratic dialogue. It talked about learning in authentic contexts and, attention to transfer, learning in novel contexts. So, you think of labs and them being really authentic, where students are really playing a central role in the developing of the labs. And it talked about organizing new ideas in a way that stresses connection, so you think about, again, Socratic dialogue or concept mapping. And it just was such a good list and a different way to think about what active learning really is. I didn't kind of think of it in terms of those descriptors.
I think that's a
Go
good
ahead.
point and such a good connection to the curriculum, because what I found with the curriculum was that so many opportunities for formative assessment. And because again, so often our teaching is because again, we've got to cover it all. And we'll do the test at the end so I can figure out whether or not anybody learned anything. And that was exciting for me. And it was a little bit scary at first because I felt like, oh, I don't have time for this constant formative assessment. I got to keep moving. But once I started realizing, no, there's just constant opportunities. It's a constant discussion that you can always figure out, okay, whoa, we have to stop right here because this group really needs help, or the whole class really needs help. Where, we're not understanding things. So let's back up. And that's so powerful when we are focusing on the learning as opposed to the work. I got to keep moving whether or not they get it. And, and this group is just going to have to be left behind. And I'm not sure what to do about that. And I felt so empowered as a teacher because I knew what was going on and I could stop before things had gone, before I gave the end of the unit test and realized nobody, maybe 10% really understood what was going on. And that felt so great to me as a teacher when I could stop a group right away, like, oh, hold on, let's talk about that a little bit more and see where they're going. And I could correct something. And so everybody again, which seemed overwhelming at first, but I started to get much more comfortable with the various entry levels. Okay, that group is here. They're doing well, but they're not where that group is. So how can I support them in different ways?
I think routines too. Like if you make thinking moves, make it routine for the kids, then they're going to be able to, independently use in different contexts. So I think making thinking routine is really key.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
that sort of speaks to making a part of the culture, right? Because the routines
Right.
become part of how we engage in the
Right.
discipline, how we engage in, and I think about this and I think about focusing on the learning or the work. When I hear that, I always thought of myself in the classroom teaching with KnowAtom and kind of like my role as almost being the facilitator, the lab manager, like almost like if I had like a little lab, like a business that I, of working for Pfizer and I'm in charge of this, group of 30
Right.
people. And so I wasn't doing the work, not to use that word, but they were the ones engaging in the tasks. But I trusted them I trusted their ability to engage in the task. I gave them agency to engage in the task. And I felt like my focus was not just getting out of the way and sort of leaving them alone because they're kids. Like I couldn't like step out of the room, and just, hey, I'll be back in an hour. That's not that, that doesn't fit for a lot of reasons. But what I felt like I was always trying to keep my mind's eye on was, is the door locked to understanding, or is it unlocked? And if it's locking, how can I help unlock it? And so the thing is it's really, for me, I felt like a gatekeeper in some respects. I couldn't walk through the door for my students, but I had these different tools. I could ask questions, I could pull the whole group together, and we could reflect on the moment, we could reflect on the struggle. I could choose to cut the time off and come back together and reflect, and we could go in a new direction in some way. So for me, it was always kind of focusing on the learning, but focusing on the level of opportunity and the different, and I think that's where the differentiation comes in. You mentioned earlier, Lori, about their transactional models of instruction really not being differentiated at all. And people fool themselves with leveled readers and these different sort of things into thinking that they're differentiating instruction, but they're not. The differentiation comes in where you, as a teacher, it's sort of the lab manager, you're walking around your classroom, and I think about that active learning. That term gets used, and to what I think the point that was made earlier, a lot of people look through the classroom window and they see kids moving around and they say, oh, it's active learning. And that's sort of one definition of it. I think what we were discussing earlier is actually active learning is more than some kind of physical movement and interaction with materials. It's being active with the concept, and it's the concept having action and activity and being dynamic in the way students can interact with it and use it. And maybe that's through discussion, maybe that's through thinking routines, like picture thinking routine, maybe that's through scientific process or engineering design process. It's all of the above, hopefully. Like in the KnowAtom, that's the way it's designed. But I think about how I can probe and challenge and support student thinking as being completely tied to the kind of opportunities or the doors that I, as the teacher, leave unlocked for kids to have the option of walking through.
And monitoring the challenge, like keeping an eye on. I felt like that was always a big role when I was facilitating labs, was monitoring the amount of challenge and knowing when to how to kind of dance around that when it felt like it was too much or it wasn't enough, and sort of playing that, keeping an eye on that was always really important.
But I think I think that's like a double-edged sword too, though. Like I think as teachers, we naturally keep an eye on those things when students, like let's say they get frustrated. That's like that to me. I feel like the rescuer kind of side of it sometimes is where we can get in trouble. But the other side of it is
I didn't mean that I would do it to rescue. It was monitoring the amount of challenge to figure out where to go from there, not necessarily swoop in and rescue. You know
right.
what I
And
mean?
I wasn't suggesting that you were.
No, I know.
But the other side of it, I think that you're getting at here is often overlooked, where I think a lot of people say we need to keep an eye on the challenge to rescue students because we don't want them to have this negative experience and this frustration and give up and so on. But the other side of that is, how can we honor the struggle and how can we help students engage in the struggle productively, even if it's helping them to develop positive coping mechanisms. Like, for example, seeing a student who's showing some signs of frustration and walking over to that team and saying, tell me how it's going. Tell me, like, where have you made progress? Where are you finding a challenge right now? How do you feel about that challenge? And then even like modeling coping techniques. Like, when I feel frustrated, sometimes what I like to do is I like to talk to my partner about my frustration, or I get to go talk to another team about what I'm finding frustrating to see if they might have some ideas. Or, and so what we can do is we can help students engage in the struggle more productively, maybe that's saving them in a sense, but it's saving them in a very different way than just going in and being like,
it's not doing the thinking for them.
These kids can't handle engineering. I need to give them a way of building this car because they can't handle that. Like, that's the saving part that leads to less learning.
That's what I mean, is just paying attention to that so that it doesn't get out of control and it doesn't implode, that you're helping them through that in the appropriate way.
And I think that's so important. And again, that's that continual formative assessment where you can help them think about their thinking and think about other ways to, like you mentioned, Francis, which I was really loved when my students started feeling comfortable about that, considering a different perspective. Can we go check in with that group and see? And I saw so much of that in many classrooms where students would, wait, mine never did go that far. What are they doing? And giving them permission. That's like giving them so much trust. Yeah, go check with them. That's not cheating. That's not being bad. That's considering different perspectives.
Yes, and I think part of that too is, so we've got this thing of getting used to productive struggle and helping students, I think, engage in that. I think there's another parallel, but I think in some ways related battle, which is that the classroom is not a place where we're we're defining winners and losers. I think that there's this element of having the right answer, that a transactional environment creates the sense of having the right answer is winning.
Yeah.
It's getting the A. It's
The
being
quiz show.
successful. It's the quiz show model, exactly. And that the opposite of that is losing. When you don't have the right answer, you lose the quiz show. You don't, whatever, you don't become the
That's when kids
semifinalist of
shut
some.
down. They become less curious. They're less
Exactly.
engaged. Yeah.
Exactly. And so again, back to that relational model, the more that we can create an environment where students are developing this authentic relationship to the skills and to the content and to really the discipline of bringing those together for a purpose, that's where struggles become productive, but also the struggle is viewed, I think, as meaningful as opposed to a sign of loss or a sign of inadequacy. And I think there's a lot of adults that struggle with that. I mean, I think it's something we take from our elementary
Mhm.
years right into adulthood, and struggling. I don't care if somebody works, um, stacking boxes one on top of another. Like if they struggle to do it, is that being inadequate at your job? Like not necessarily. Like, you know, um, and I think that speaks to um, this quote here: when presenting a task, we need to make it a habit to lead with the thinking students will need to do and the purpose of that thinking. Teachers tend to explain an activity, a task, or an assignment in terms of the mechanical aspects or the steps of that task. But I think as we've been talking about, the mechanical aspects and the steps of that task are the transactional parts. It's not the thinking, it's not the learning, it's not the value. And I, I, I really loved this question because it, it hit me in the gut a little bit because I thought, imagine, I imagine how students, like my first year as a teacher versus my last year as a teacher, what my students would have said if somebody walked in. I know the question here is, could my students tell an outsider what kinds of thinking are important in my class? But the question that came up in my mind when I saw this was, what do my students see as an important kind of thinking in my class? Do they see thinking as important at all?
Yeah.
And I
It hit
think
me in the gut too, because I thought my kids probably would have said yes, thinking's important, but I don't know if they would have had a label for the kinds of
I do
thinking,
think so.
unfortunately. And I think as a teacher, the first thing you have to do is identify the thinking for yourself. But then also, I was thinking involve the students eventually, not always telling them the kinds of thinking you're expecting, but invite them to build their own repertoire and ask them, what kinds of thinking do you think we need to solve this problem or write this piece of writing or, accomplish this goal. So then they would be able to tell if they were involved in the process of it, right?
Right.
exactly. And I think exactly the more we can involve them in that, the better. But I just I have flashbacks to high school and to my own college experience around this. And I think of students saying like, you don't have to go to class, just read the book, you know? And it's like, that kind of sums it all up. You know, if you don't need to go to class and you can just read the book, the class has no value.
Yeah.
And in a sense, the teacher of that class,
I was just gonna say that.
there's no value.
If the book can replace it, that's a problem.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's like, what kind of thinking is required? None.
Yeah.
That's the horrible answer to that question, I think. And
To me, that's the heart of collaboration too, and why it was such an integral part of my classroom too, because that's not something you can get in a book, and you can't just read about it. And, you know, working with others and thinking with others does so much for your own perspectives on things.
Oh, and it helps. I always think about when I went back to school to get my master's in business administration. Oh my gosh, I was so far out of my comfort zone. It was incredible. And the books were, oh, they were so challenging for me. And I was just doing so poorly because I wasn't understanding the books. And I felt so, oh, I could so relate to my kids who I used to teach because I felt so like, I mean, I would call myself dumb and stupid. And and any tests that was a result of reading the book, I was doing really poorly on. It was terrifying to me. And we had a teacher where we had to do a group project. And at first I was terrified because I was like, oh my gosh, this is everybody's going to see how dumb I am. And it was so amazing for me because we were working on this group project. I was in a really good group. It was a group of 4 of us, and we were all very different. We were different ages, different. And I started, and I couldn't have named it at the time. I didn't know what kind of thinking are we all engaging in, but it was amazing where all of a sudden, first of all, I felt comfortable asking questions, but as we were creating this project, I started making connections back to the book and things that I read and was just, I have no idea what this is talking about. All of a sudden I was grabbing the book and going, oh, wait a minute, this is what the book was talking about when we were doing XYZ. And it was so, it made such a difference. And Lori, I think that importance that I realized when I went back to teaching was the importance of discourse and group projects and seeing, hearing somebody else's perspective was so illuminating to me that, oh, whoa, this is how they consider it. I thought there was only one way to think about this, and yet this is an acceptable way. So I think, and I couldn't have labeled the kind of thinking, but I was very aware that something very different was happening to me. And I was very aware that I was actually learning. And I knew it had something to do with sharing the experience with others and thinking about things in different ways.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I think learning creates agency. I think it's one of the signals that learning's happening, is that agency is increasing for the learner. And
Yes.
this is a kind of maybe a silly analogy, but I'm always interested to watch people unload a dishwasher in a house that they is not their own.
Unload or load?
Unload a
Because
dishwasher.
there's a lot to loading it too.
There
Yeah,
is.
you're
It's
right.
very interesting. I find it's just, it's very interesting. I feel like there are these, we call them proxies for different things. And watching somebody unload a dishwasher in a kitchen that's not their own is really interesting to me because there are so many different things that are in the dishwasher. There are forks and knives and little cutting things and plates and bowls and like all kinds of stuff. And there's stuff for serving and there's stuff for cooking. And when you look across a kitchen, there's all these different cabinets and drawers and locations where these things could go. And I almost think it's also a little bit illuminating about the kind of learner I think and the educational experience a person has come from as well sometimes. And like you're gonna think I'm out there around this, but hear me out.
No, I'm
Is that
laughing because I'm kind of relating to it actually.
is that it can be instantly overwhelming because you might have 100 different things that could go in potentially 50 different places. So in a very transactional sense, you could ask a question about each item that comes out of the dishwasher. Where does this go? And then somebody then, as the teacher, directs the individual. It goes here, it goes there, it goes here, it goes
Yeah.
there. There's then kind of a different approach, which is, as the teacher, you could say, well, things that are needed for cooking are next to the stove. And if if
Or you could
they
say open all the drawers.
well you could say open all the drawers, but like there's different potentially ways of going about this. But from a framework perspective,
Mhm.
it's like if if um if dishes go near the sink and cooking things go the the stove, we've now just really created a big different thing. If they're utensils, they go in drawers, and if they're cooking utensils, they go in drawers next to the stove, and if they're eating utensils, they're in drawers next to the dishes. Suddenly, you've created a framework where maybe people won't they're going to encounter some challenge, but they actually develop agency in being able to complete this task because now they can engage their thinking around what goes where. And when they open up a drawer or a cabinet, they then will try to understand the relationship between what they're holding and what's there, as opposed to trying to find out if they're putting it in the right place on a one-by-one basis. And so I'm always kind of interested by watching these sort of things because like as a teacher, you could picture I could picture myself like, well, what do I do? Do I label every drawer, all the different things that go in there? Um, and so I don't know, and then the other thing you think about the flexibility. So every time that you have something different for dinner, there's different dishes and in the dishwasher. So potentially you could go through this pointing at drawers every single time if somebody's helping you unload the dishwasher, And so I think
And the
in the
different levels of scaffolding you could do
Yeah,
that.
but I also like that story because think about that as well, whether it's teacher versus student, because you figured that out. If a person said to you, well, that's not the right place, why would you do that? You can talk about, well, here's the reason why. So it's so powerful because that person doesn't assume, well, like Francis just put things wherever the heck he wanted. Oh, that was a very thoughtful move. So, I might think about, you've changed my thinking, Francis. I should put those bowls over there. So I think, as a teacher-student perspective, that's such a cool thing as opposed to, well, you did that wrong.
Mm,
The teacher questioning, saying, whoa, I'm curious. Why did
mhm,
you do it that way? And it
mhm,
becomes a very empowering thing, which again can lead to, a really great outcome of great idea. I like it.
mhm. And it's empowering too in the I think in the trust sense. It's and even
Yeah.
communicating the thinking that you're looking for. It's like if you open a drawer and all the bowls are glass and you're holding a plastic bowl, maybe there's another drawer that has plastic bowls. It caught like thinking begets thinking. And it's also sort of that empowerment of I'm looking for you to just make an association between what's there and a decision. Um,
I trust you.
I trust you, exactly. So this is our last quote. Um, when teachers focus on students getting the correct answers or completing the assignment correctly, there's a tendency to over-scaffold the task in such a way that it's stripped of learning in contrast, when teachers pay attention to students' thinking, they're able to prompt the thinking students will need to be successful independently. And I just think of that example just a second ago. It's like,
Yeah,
you know,
I was
somebody's
just gonna
like,
say, how can you not?
where does this go? Where
In
does
the
this bowl
cabinet
go?
above the
Yeah, you could go that route, or you say, you know, does it go in this drawer or this drawer? I don't know. Is it a glass bowl? Is that a glass drawer or a plastic drawer? And so by answering the question with the question, you're further empowering and further prompting thinking and engagement in the task. This last question here, do you find yourself over scaffolding to be the rescuer? How can you build your trust in your students and their ability to think and learn? I feel like we've been kind of dancing around that, but I don't know if either of you have a direct reflection on that.
I think about the teacher who said to me when I had watched just an absolutely amazing lesson that the class had done, and there was so many great things going on, and there was so much release of responsibility. And it was just absolutely stunning to me. And so I was asking her about it afterwards, and I said, how did this happen? And it was fun because we kind of did a rewind where I was like, what were the points at which you could say, wait a minute, this isn't going well, I need to change this? And she said, what was my very first thing? She said it was allowing them to get their own materials. I had always delivered a little basket to each group. Here's your materials. And she said that was the beginning. And they felt so empowered. They felt so excited. They felt like I had just given them, the key to whatever, that I trusted that they were going to get the materials that they needed. They were going to respect the materials. They were going to respect each other. They were going to look at, their needs. So they didn't, if there were only, you could have no more than 5 elastics, that was up to them. So I think that I loved that moment that she could identify that. And she said that wasn't, I didn't do that easily. I was terrified, but they showed me that they could handle it. So she said it was kind of a little by little that I could go, well, they could handle that. My goodness. So let's go. So I think it's those small, gentle release of responsibility that you can let them prove it to you. Let them show you that they can do this.
This might seem oversimplified, but that's a great example of trust. But even just saying, those magic phrases that we're talking about, what makes you say that? Can you tell me more? Maybe subtly or not so subtly, you're saying to your student, I'm interested in your thinking,
Yes.
and that in turn builds trust in them that you trust that they can think and learn.
Yeah.
You're going to push them and you're going to make them think, and that's why they're there in your classroom.
I can handle that.
I agree. I feel like the words are important to draw students' attention to an area, but I feel like the students believe who you are. They believe what you do. They believe what you live. And so by starting your class, by showing students that you don't trust them to receive materials on their own, to make simple choices and conduct themselves appropriately, I don't care what you say, they're going to view themselves as in that box of somewhere below deserving the trust and agency to conduct themselves in a appropriate way. And I think I've seen that. I've seen where students have had that agency taken away, and I've called this in the past like a prison mentality, where it's like, well, if that's who I am, I will step into that space. And so the lack of trust and the lack of empowerment becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy of students misbehaving and students acting certain ways because it becomes a wrestling. They're kind of like wrestling for agency. They're pushing in their own way. They're pushing the boundaries, and sort of demonstrating almost in like a toddler sense, like,
Mhm.
you know, I can make choices too. Like I have wants and needs too. Like I want to exercise agency here, and so I'm going to push up against you not giving that to me, and now we're going to have a battle of the wills, as opposed to that feeling of, and I agree, in my own class, I mean, I think about students, even kindergartners, they put those goggles on and how magical that is. And suddenly it's like when students are wearing their goggles or their safety glasses, they, for some reason, they are scientists in that moment. And it's like, it's not only the specialness of having these real safety glasses, but I think it's the idea that we're going to do something that's potentially dangerous. Like
They
that
love the goggles.
that
So
sense of
funny.
Yes.
danger, that it,
And I
even
never
though
thought of it that way.
it's the sense of danger, right? It's like,
Yeah.
oh my goodness, this is real. We
Yeah.
might get hurt. We might, like, and and
Is
of
that
course,
why they love
but
them?
like, and I think it's like they take that seriously. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm going to get to use something that is
Mm,
not like a super engineered child's toy that could,
Mm.
that nothing could go wrong with. And of course, we're not giving them things that'll cost them their lives or limbs, but it does say something, I
Mhm.
think, it's very deep about what we believe students are capable of, and in terms of trust and decision making, and like almost instantly and palpably respond to that. I've found that in my classes.
yeah. And kids are smart. You can't fake it. It has to
Definitely,
be real. Right?
definitely. Wonderful. Well, unless you have something else you'd like to add to this is our last slide. So we can, I don't know if there are any takeaways or reflections from this, or we can wrap it up.
I think we again covered a lot.
We did
We
cover a
did.
lot.
We wrapped
So,
up a lot.
so in wrapping up here, I just want to thank everyone again. Thank Lori, Judy, for your time. I'm Francis Vidgen. If you'd like to visit this discussion again or take a look at any of the resources related to it, you can go to KnowAtom.com. You can also find connections to these resources on X, formerly known as Twitter, by going to our handle @KnowAtom or Facebook.com/KnowAtom. Thanks again, and we wish you luck on your journey.